The small town of Rosewood County was always quiet, as if time itself had taken a pause. The streets were lined with rows of old houses, their peeling paint telling tales of decades gone by. Broken Elm Street, the last street on the cul-de-sac, stood out, not because of its age or charm, but because of the deep, unsettling silence that surrounded it. It was the kind of silence that made you feel as though something was missing, something important, something you couldn't quite place. In the summer of 1989, 3 young boys, identical triplets, had vanished without a trace from this very street. One moment, they were playing in their front yard, riding their bikes beneath the wide branches of the old elm tree that stood tall in the middle of the street. The next, they were simply gone. No tire marks, no broken fence, no footprints, just the fading echoes of their laughter, swallowed by the emptiness that soon followed. The house they had once called home, number 214, stood there, abandoned for years after their disappearance, with its dark windows staring blankly into the street. Neighbors moved away, their memories leaving just as quietly as the boys had. But for some reason, Rosewood County never quite let go of the story, and neither did Elaine Cooper, their mother. For years, the case remained cold. The police had no leads, no bodies, no explanation. It wasn't until 35 years later, when a young couple, Ben and Leah Ramirez, moved into the house across from where the triplets had vanished, that things began to change. They were renovating the old house, hoping to bring it back to life, but they were unaware that the walls held secrets, memories, and clues that had been buried for decades. It started on a warm June afternoon. Ben was working alone in the garage, trying to clear away the debris left behind by years of neglect. The sun poured through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the old wooden beams. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and forgotten things. As he pried open a loose section of the wall with a crowbar, the sound of creaking would echo through the garage. The boards gave way with a sharp crack. For a moment, Ben froze, staring at what lay behind. It was a small wooden crate, wedged between the studs of the wall, covered in layers of dust. A faint smell of old paper lingered in the air. There was something unsettling about it, something that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Leah, who had been sorting through old boxes in the driveway, looked up at the sound. "What is it?" she called, walking over to him. Ben wiped the sweat from his brow and gave her a half-hearted smile. "I think we found something," he muttered, his voice strained with the odd feeling settling in his chest. Leah raised an eyebrow and walked over, her curiosity piqued. Together, they stared at the crate. It was old, weathered, and locked shut with nails that had long since rusted. But there was no mistaking the sense of something hidden, something deliberately kept out of sight for years. "Should we open it?" Leah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ben hesitated, unsure. But then, curiosity got the better of him. He pried at the crate with the crowbar, the rusted nails groaning under the pressure. With a final, satisfying crack, the crate's lid popped open. Inside, the dust seemed to rise like a cloud from an ancient tomb. But it wasn't what was visible that made Ben's stomach twist. It was what lay beneath it all. A child's toy fire truck, missing its wheels, sat on top, its paint chipped and faded. Next to it, a tangled mess of yo-yos and a yellowed laminated school library card lay untouched. But the most haunting discovery was a small, red and blue spiral notebook, filled with backward letters and crude stick figures. And beneath it all was a single photograph. Leah picked it up carefully, almost reverently, as if the photograph might crumble in her hands. She looked at the image in silence for a moment before turning it over. The photograph showed 3 young boys, identical in every way, standing together in matching red jackets. They were smiling, their arms around each other, their faces so full of life. Behind them was the unmistakable sight of the house they had once lived in. The same crooked porch rail, the same cracked sidewalk leading up to the front steps. Her breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered. Ben stared at the photograph, his heart racing. He'd seen it before, but it had always been an image of a distant memory. A story that belonged to someone else. Now it was staring back at him. The boys, the house. There was no mistake. The triplets. For the first time in 35 years, the past had come back to life. Ben stood up slowly, his fingers shaking. The air felt heavier now, like a storm had settled in. He glanced over at Leia, whose face had turned pale as she held the photograph in her hands. "These boys, they were from this street, weren't they?" Ben said softly, as if speaking the words would somehow make them more real. Leia nodded, her voice catching in her throat. "Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper. They went missing in 1989. The case was never solved." The walls of the garage seemed to close in on them as the full weight of the discovery settled in. Ben stepped outside, looking across the street at the old, shuttered house where the triplets had lived. The house, still standing, was no longer just a relic of the past. It was a portal into the mystery that had never been solved. And suddenly, the question that had haunted Rosewood County for decades felt like it was right in front of him. Where had the triplets gone? Rosewood County had always been a place where time seemed to stand still. It wasn't a town that made headlines. Nothing ever happened here that seemed important enough to be noticed by the outside world. The streets were quiet, the houses unremarkable, and the people, for the most part, led simple lives, tucked away from the chaos of bigger cities. For most of the residents, that was exactly how they liked it. But for the Cooper family, the quiet was never enough. The day everything changed, it was as if the very air had been sucked out of the town, leaving behind a hollow void that would never truly be filled. The triplets, Daniel, Evan, and Miles Cooper, were born on a summer morning in 1982, their arrival marking the end of a long wait for Elaine Cooper, their mother. Elaine had always dreamed of having children, but having triplets was a blessing that neither she nor her husband, Carl, had ever imagined. The three boys were identical in nearly every way, each one as full of energy and life as the next. Their laughter filled the Cooper home, bouncing off the walls and echoing in the yard, especially under the shade of the old elm tree that stood in the front yard. For the first few years of their lives, everything seemed perfect. But as with all things, nothing lasts forever. By 1989, when the boys were 7 years old, life had become more challenging for Elaine and Carl. Carl's work schedule at the factory was grueling, and his long hours took a toll on their marriage. Elaine, though, remained devoted to her children. She spent her days caring for the triplets, keeping their small world full of love and laughter, despite the growing tension in the house. But one thing remained constant: the triplets' connection to the old elm tree. It was their favorite place, a place they often ran to after school, where they would play, talk, and dream. The summer of 1989 was a particularly hot one, with the sun beating down relentlessly on the small town. On the afternoon of June 12th, the temperature hit 95 degrees, and there was barely a breeze to offer any relief. It was just like any other afternoon when the triplets set off from their school, riding their bikes home as they had done every day. They waved goodbye to their friends at the corner of Rosewood Lane and headed down Broken Elm Street, their bicycles humming against the cracked pavement. They were laughing as they rode, just like any other day. But for some reason, this time was different. Elaine, who had been watching them from the porch, noted how strangely quiet the street had become. Her heart skipped a beat. She thought she heard something, a voice maybe, but when she turned to look, the triplets were already out of sight, disappearing around the corner. The next few hours were like a dream. A nightmare, actually. The kind that you can't wake up from. Elaine, in the kitchen preparing dinner, noticed the time. It was well past the hour when the boys usually came home. She told herself not to worry. It wasn't unusual for them to stop by the neighbor's house to play for a while. But then the sun began to dip lower in the sky, and her worry deepened. By dusk, Carl had returned home. He could tell something was wrong by the way Elaine looked. The tension in her face, the way she paced around the house, her hands wringing together. She hadn't said a word about the boys, but Carl knew. He knew. "Where are they?" he asked, his voice low. "I don't know," Elaine whispered, her voice trembling. "They should have been home by now." At first, Carl thought it was a simple misunderstanding. They were probably playing with their friends, or maybe had wandered farther than usual. But when he walked outside to check the street and saw no sign of them, the weight of fear began to settle in his stomach. The night was still, and the street was empty. Not a sound, not even the rustling of leaves from the old elm tree. Elaine was frantic. She called every house on Broken Elm Street, asking neighbors if they had seen the boys. Everyone said the same thing. They hadn't seen them, not since they rode past on their bikes. With a growing sense of dread, Carl called the police. Within an hour, the town was on edge. The sheriff's department arrived, and soon, what had seemed like a simple case of children being late turned into something far more sinister. The sheriff, a stout man named Tom Hargrove, began asking questions. He was methodical, calm, but his eyes showed concern. "Did they have any enemies?" he asked. "No," Elaine said. "They were just kids. Everyone loved them." The search for the triplets started immediately. Police combed through the neighborhood, knocking on doors, checking local parks, and calling for the children in every direction. They asked neighbors if they had seen anything unusual that day. But everyone said the same thing: no, nothing unusual. As the night wore on, the frustration grew. There was nothing to go on. No clues, no leads, no signs of struggle. No sounds, just an empty street, a quiet neighborhood, and a growing sense of helplessness. At first light, the search escalated. Officers combed through nearby woods and fields, calling out for the triplets. But the longer they searched, the more apparent it became that something was wrong. Their bikes were missing. No tire marks, no footprints, no sign of where they had gone. Elaine refused to leave the house. Carl stayed close to her, his own heart heavy with dread. Days passed without any trace of the boys. The police interviews became routine. Same questions, same answers. The triplets had vanished without a trace. By the end of the first week, the case was already beginning to slip into the shadows of unsolved mysteries. The small town of Rosewood, which had always been so peaceful, was beginning to feel cold and empty. People talked in hushed voices, speculating about what had happened. Was it an accident? Or had something worse happened? But the answers never came. Elaine's world shattered. She stayed in the house, staring at the empty street, waiting for her boys to return. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. But the police didn't have anything to go on. The case went cold. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And soon, months became years. In 1990, the case was officially closed, and the triplets' disappearance became just another forgotten story, buried beneath the weight of time. The neighbors moved away. The house at 214 Broken Elm Street remained vacant for years, a haunting reminder of the tragedy. But Elaine never moved. And as the years passed, she kept waiting, waiting for the truth to come out. For someone, anyone, to remember the triplets. But nobody ever did. Until now. The summer heat of Rosewood County hung thick in the air as Ben Ramirez wiped his brow, standing in the middle of the garage at 214 Broken Elm Street. The house, long abandoned, seemed to breathe with a quiet kind of sadness. He had spent the better part of the afternoon clearing out old boxes, broken furniture, and decades of dust, determined to make the space livable again for his wife, Leah, and himself. They had moved in just a few months ago, eager to leave behind the noise of the city and embrace the slower pace of small-town life. But today, as the crowbar pried loose a section of the warped drywall, Ben's thoughts strayed from the house's potential. He felt the familiar chill of something unsettling, something he couldn't quite place. The wall seemed to give way far too easily, almost as though it had been waiting for someone to uncover it. As the last section of drywall fell to the floor, Ben caught sight of something hidden behind the old studs. A small wooden crate. For a moment, Ben stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. The crate was old, its wood faded and splintering with age, and it was wedged tightly into the narrow gap between the wall studs. It was strange, the way it had been concealed. The house had been empty for years, yet this crate had remained untouched. Ben felt an odd pull of curiosity, as if the crate itself were begging to be opened, offering some sort of long-forgotten secret. "Leah!" Ben called over his shoulder, his voice trembling slightly. "You're going to want to see this." Leah, who had been sorting through boxes in the driveway, looked up, her face already showing signs of curiosity. She wiped her hands on her faded jeans and made her way toward the garage. "What's going on?" she asked, stepping through the doorway and glancing at the crate Ben had uncovered. "I don't know," Ben said, his brow furrowing as he knelt beside the crate. "But it doesn't belong here." Leah crouched down beside him, her eyes scanning the object. "It's so old. Do you think someone left it behind?" Ben shook his head. "I don't think so. It's buried too deep in the wall to have been left by anyone who just moved out." Leah hesitated, but only for a moment. There was a certain air of mystery to the crate, an air that intrigued her just as much as it did Ben. She bent down, reaching for the rusty nails that held the crate shut. Her fingers grazed the surface, and she noticed how brittle the wood seemed, as though it had been left undisturbed for decades. "Maybe it's just some junk someone hid away," she said, but her voice betrayed the uncertainty she was feeling. Ben grabbed a nearby crowbar and gently began prying the nails loose, each squeak of the metal making his skin crawl. As the last nail came free, Ben pulled the lid off the crate with a quick motion. Dust swirled in the dim light of the garage as the lid creaked open. The smell of old paper and wood filled the air. Inside, the crate was filled with odd objects, old toys, a few tattered books, and a yellowed library card that looked as though it had been laminated years ago. But it was the photograph, tucked under a bundle of crumpled papers, that caught Ben's attention. He pulled it out slowly, his hands trembling slightly. The image was a little faded, but it was unmistakable. The three identical boys, no older than 8 or 9, dressed in matching red jackets, standing side by side. They had the same piercing blue eyes and messy brown hair, their smiles wide and carefree. Behind them stood a house. It wasn't the house they had just moved into. This was a different one. The house at 214 Broken Elm Street, but in its prime, before it fell into disrepair. It was the same house, yet the photograph seemed to freeze time, capturing the triplets before everything changed. Leah leaned over to get a closer look. Her breath caught in her throat as she recognized the triplets instantly. Those are the Cooper boys, right?" she whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. Ben didn't reply immediately, his gaze locked on the photograph. He had heard the stories, of course. Rosewood County was known for the mysterious disappearance of the Cooper triplets back in 1989. The boys had vanished without a trace, and the case had remained unsolved for decades. The photograph in Ben's hands confirmed what he had feared. It wasn't just an old relic of some forgotten past. This was the beginning of a mystery that was far from over. "This isn't possible," Leah murmured, stepping back. "How could this be here?" Ben ran his fingers over the photograph, his mind racing. The triplets had disappeared years ago, and the town had long since moved on. But this photograph was proof that something had been hidden here all along. But what? And why? Maybe we should show this to Elaine, Leia suggested hesitantly, her voice cracking slightly as she glanced at the photograph again. She's the only one who could tell us what this means. Ben shook his head. It's too soon. We don't know what this means yet. We need to look into it ourselves first. He placed the photograph gently back in the crate and carefully examined the other objects inside. There was a small toy fire truck, its wheels missing, and several scraps of paper, all torn and yellowed with age. But it was the library card that caught his attention. The name on it was familiar: Evan Cooper. It was the same name as one of the triplets, one of the boys from the photograph. I think we need to call Detective Nolan, Ben said, his voice low. This is bigger than just an old family photo. Leia nodded in agreement, her stomach sinking. She couldn't shake the feeling that this discovery was just the beginning of something far darker. She picked up the toy fire truck and examined it closely, as though looking for some hidden clue that could explain why it had been left here, in this house, behind a hidden wall. I'm going to call him, Ben said, standing up slowly. He took the photograph and the library card, walking over to his phone. If this is connected to the Cooper boys, we need to figure out how and why they were hidden here. As he dialed the number, Leia's thoughts raced. She had been in this town for only a few months, but already she had heard the whispers about the Cooper boys, the triplets who had disappeared, leaving behind nothing but empty rooms and unanswered questions. Now, standing in this old house, it seemed as though the past was pushing its way back into the present, forcing them to confront a truth that no one had wanted to face for 35 years. Ben's voice snapped her back to the present as he spoke into the phone. Detective Nolan, we found something. Something that might help solve the Cooper case. Leia felt a chill crawl up her spine as she glanced at the crate one last time. She had the distinct feeling that they had just opened a door that could never be closed. The air in the garage felt thick with tension as Ben and Leia stood in the dim light, staring at the wooden crate. The discovery had shaken them both, and despite their best efforts to remain calm, they couldn't help but feel the weight of what they had just unearthed. The photograph, the toy fire truck, the laminated library card with Evan Cooper's name on it. It all pointed to one undeniable truth. This crate, hidden behind a wall for decades, was a relic tied to the Cooper triplets, the boys who had vanished all those years ago. Leia paced the floor, her mind racing. This doesn't make sense, she muttered to herself, her eyes darting back to the crate. How could something like this be here? Why was it hidden? Ben, still holding the photograph and library card in his hands, turned to face her. I don't know, but I think we need to figure that out before we get anyone else involved. Leia stopped pacing and looked at him. You're right. But what if Elaine knows something? She's the one who was there, the one who lived through all of this. We have to tell her. Ben hesitated. He understood the impulse to bring Elaine into it, but something told him they needed to dig deeper on their own before involving her. He didn't want to drag her back into a nightmare unless they had something concrete to show her. We need to know more, Ben said finally. There's too much here to just rush into a conversation with her. Let's figure out what this all means first. Leia nodded, her anxiety evident. She wasn't sure she agreed, but she understood his point. The last thing they needed was to make things worse for Elaine, to bring up painful memories before they had a clear understanding of what they were dealing with. With the decision made, they turned their attention back to the crate. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath them was the only sound that broke the silence as they carefully examined its contents once more. Ben picked up the toy fire truck, turning it over in his hands. The wheels had long since fallen off, the once vibrant paint faded and chipped. It was a relic of the past, but it held no answers on its own. The real clue, however, was the photograph. The triplets stood there in matching jackets, smiling like they had no cares in the world. Behind them, the house was pristine. Nothing like the broken, abandoned structure it had become today. Leia picked up the library card next. "Evan Cooper," she said softly, reading the name aloud. "This is one of the triplets. This card must have belonged to him." Ben nodded. "This is all too much. Why would this stuff be hidden in the wall? And why was it left behind for so long? If someone had come back here, wouldn't they have taken it?" That was the question that lingered in both their minds. Why was this crate left behind? It seemed too deliberate, too planned. And if the crate had been hidden for so long, what had happened to it in the meantime? Who had known it was here? Ben stood up and walked over to the workbench at the far end of the garage, the tools scattered haphazardly across the counter. He ran a hand through his hair, feeling frustrated. There were too many unknowns, and not enough answers. We need to look into this house. We need to know who lived here before us. Leia, who had been staring at the photograph, seemed to snap out of her trance. "You mean the previous owners? The people who lived here before we moved in?" "Exactly," Ben replied. "Someone knew about this crate. Someone was hiding it." Leia's eyes widened as the implications began to settle in. But that would mean the person who lived here before us knew something about the triplets, knew about what happened to them. "Maybe," Ben said, his mind working through the possibilities. "But we need more to go on. Right now, we don't know if this crate was placed here by someone who was involved in the disappearance, or if it was just left behind by accident." Leia's hands trembled as she set the photograph and library card back into the crate. "I don't know if I can wait to find out, Ben. This feels wrong. It feels like we're being pulled into something we don't understand." Ben could hear the edge of panic in her voice, and he understood. The discovery had rattled them both, but it was the unknowns, the questions they couldn't answer, that were making everything feel worse. The crate was tangible, yes, but its contents raised so many more questions than answers. "We'll figure this out, Leia," Ben said, his voice firm. "But we need to approach this carefully. We don't know who we're dealing with yet, and we don't know what they want. We can't afford to rush into anything." He looked at Leia, seeing the concern written across her face. She wanted to act on impulse, to confront Elaine, to find the truth immediately. But Ben was right. They couldn't let their emotions drive their next move. This mystery, as unsettling as it was, required patience. "Okay," Leia said quietly, nodding in agreement. "But what do we do now?" Ben walked back to the crate and gently closed the lid. He locked eyes with Leia. "We keep this safe. We document everything. We take pictures of the items, make a record of what we found, and then we start digging into the history of this house. We need to know who lived here before us." Leia exhaled a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. "You're right. We need to be careful." With that, Ben pulled out his phone and began snapping pictures of the crate and its contents, capturing every angle. Leia stood beside him, watching as he worked, feeling a sense of urgency rise in her chest. They couldn't afford to let this slip away. Whatever they had uncovered here was important, too important to ignore. Once the photos were taken, Ben tucked his phone back into his pocket. "Let's go talk to the neighbors. The people who live next door. Maybe they remember something." Leia hesitated but then nodded. "All right, let's do it." Together, they left the garage, stepping into the quiet afternoon air. As they made their way toward the neighbor's house, Ben's mind raced with possibilities. The crate was only the beginning. But who could they trust? And more importantly, what had the Cooper family known, or not known, about what had happened to their children? As they reached the neighbor's door, Leia knocked, her heart pounding. She had no idea what they would learn, or how far down the rabbit hole they were about to go. But one thing was certain. They were no longer just curious renovators. They were now a part of a mystery that had haunted this town for far too long. The sun was beginning to set over Rosewood County, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Ben and Leah walked side by side, the weight of what they had discovered still heavy in the air between them. Their destination was just across the street, the house that had once been home to the triplets, a house that still stood empty, its windows dark and lifeless. But they weren't going to the house. Instead, they were headed to Elaine Cooper's house, the woman who had once been a mother of 3, whose life had been irrevocably changed when her children vanished. Elaine lived in a modest house on the corner of Broken Elm Street, a short walk from their own. The house was well kept but worn, like a living memory that hadn't quite let go of the past. Her garden, though small, was full of flowers, the bright colors a stark contrast to the shadow that seemed to hang over her life. Ben and Leah approached the front door and hesitated. They both felt the weight of what they were about to do, bringing up old memories, reopening wounds that had never truly healed. It felt wrong, almost intrusive, but they had no choice. The photograph, the library card, and the other items they had found in the crate, it all pointed back to Elaine's children. If anyone knew anything, it would be her. Ben knocked gently on the door, and after a moment it opened. Elaine stood there, her face lined with years of grief and pain, her eyes tired but sharp. She was in her mid-50s now, but the memories of her children seemed to make her older, as if time had stopped for her the day they disappeared. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. "Hi, Elaine," Ben said, forcing a smile, though he felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. "We're Ben and Leah Ramirez. We just moved into the house across the street." Elaine's eyes flickered to Leah, then back to Ben. There was a pause, and Ben could see the recognition in her gaze, the understanding that they weren't just curious neighbors. They knew about the triplets. They knew about her loss. "We found something," Leah said, stepping forward a little. "Something in the garage of the house. We thought you might want to see it." Elaine's expression shifted, and for the briefest moment, it was as if the world itself had shifted under her feet. She took a step back, motioning for them to enter. "Come in," she said quietly, her voice thick with hesitation. The interior of Elaine's home was neat, though it had the feel of a place that hadn't truly been lived in for years. The walls were lined with pictures, mostly old photos of the triplets, frozen in time. There was a photo of them riding their bikes, another of them laughing in front of the house, their faces shining with joy. The walls seemed to tell a story of happier times, but beneath it all, there was a quiet sorrow that lingered in every corner. Elaine led them into the small living room, where the scent of lavender lingered in the air. She motioned for them to sit, her hands trembling slightly as she folded them in her lap. Ben and Leah exchanged a glance before Ben spoke. "We found a crate in the garage, hidden behind the wall." Elaine's face went pale at the mention of the crate. Her eyes immediately narrowed, as though she already knew what they were talking about. "What was in it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We found some old things," Leah replied, her voice soft. "A photograph, some toys, and a library card. It had Evan Cooper's name on it." Elaine's breath hitched. She stood up suddenly, her chair scraping across the floor. "Evan," she whispered, as if the name itself was a memory she had almost forgotten. "Evan was my oldest. He was always so serious, even as a little boy. He liked to read." She paused, her eyes glazing over as she stared at nothing in particular. "But you found it? His name, his card." Ben nodded slowly. "Yes, and there were other things too, but the photograph, Elaine, the boys were in it. All 3 of them." Elaine sank back into her chair, her hands gripping the armrests. Her face crumpled as if the weight of the past had finally caught up with her. "I knew they were gone. I knew something had happened. But I never thought I would find something like that. Not after all these years." Leia reached out, her hand resting lightly on Elaine's. "Elaine, we don't know what this means. We don't know why it was hidden, or who put it there. But we think it's connected to the boys. We think it's connected to their disappearance." Elaine closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I never thought anyone would remember them. I've spent so many years just waiting for them to come back. I've never given up on them, but there are times when I've wondered if I'm just holding on to a memory that's fading." Ben looked at her sympathetically. He could see the pain in her eyes, the pain of a mother who had lost her children, who had been left with nothing but unanswered questions and empty rooms. The town had moved on, but Elaine had stayed frozen in time, clinging to the hope that one day, somehow, her children would return. "Elaine," Ben began gently, "we need to know more about the house, the people who lived there before us. Did anyone ever say anything about the triplets? About what happened?" Elaine looked up at him, her eyes cloudy with confusion. "I don't know. People left after the boys disappeared. They didn't talk about it much. It's like everyone just moved on, pretending nothing ever happened. But I never moved. I couldn't leave." Leia's heart went out to her. She couldn't imagine the pain of living every day in the shadow of that kind of loss. But now, with the photograph, the crate, and the library card, there was the possibility of answers. The past, which had seemed so distant, was suddenly coming alive. "Elaine," Leia said softly, "we think the triplets were hidden. Maybe they were kept somewhere, and maybe they're still alive. We need to know everything. Anything you can remember about the house, the people who lived there before us. Anything that might help us find the truth." Elaine stared at them for a long moment, her mind seemingly lost in the fog of the past. Slowly, her eyes cleared, and she spoke in a low voice, as though she were speaking a secret that had been locked away for years. "There was someone," she said quietly, "a man named Vernon Hale. He was the one who lived here before. I don't know much about him, but he was odd. He kept to himself mostly, but there was something about him, something that never felt quite right. People said he was strange, that he had a temper, but I never thought much of it. I never thought that he could have had anything to do with my boys." Ben and Leia exchanged a quick glance. The name Vernon Hale lingered in the air between them, like a dark cloud. It was the first lead they had. "Vernon Hale," Ben repeated, his voice low. "We need to find out more about him." Elaine nodded slowly, her face hardening. "You should be careful. I don't know what happened to my boys, but I have a feeling that man knows more than anyone is willing to admit." Ben and Leia spent the following days piecing together the scattered remnants of the mystery that surrounded the triplets' disappearance. Each new detail they uncovered only deepened the mystery and their determination to uncover the truth. The photograph, the library card, and the eerie discovery in the hidden crate. These were just the beginning. They now had to go further, deeper into the past, and uncover the secrets that had been buried for far too long. The first piece of the puzzle they focused on was Vernon Hale. Elaine's mention of him, the man who had lived in the house before them, was the first lead they had found. It was a name, and in this town, a name could mean everything. But who was he really? What had he known about the triplets? And why was his presence in the house so unsettling to Elaine? Ben and Leia spent hours at the local library, combing through old town records and newspapers. They began with a search for Vernon Hale. It didn't take long before they found an obituary from a local newspaper dating back to the early 1990s. Vernon Hale had died under strange circumstances. His death ruled as natural causes, but there were no further details. His obituary was brief, devoid of any personal information. There were no surviving relatives mentioned. The article noted that he had been a reclusive man who had lived alone in the house at 214 Broken Elm Street for several years before his death. This sparse obituary only raised more questions. Vernon Hale's life had been largely unremarkable, at least on the surface. Yet Elaine had described him as odd. A man with a temper who kept to himself. Something about this description didn't sit right with Ben. He had a gut feeling that Vernon Hale was the key to understanding what had really happened to the Cooper triplets. Next, Ben and Leah turned their attention to the house itself. They returned to 214 Broken Elm Street and began their own investigation into its history. They needed to know everything about the property, the previous owners, its condition, and any potential events that could have occurred there before they moved in. It wasn't long before they discovered that the house had gone through multiple ownerships in the years following the Cooper family's departure. Vernon Hale was the most recent occupant before Ben and Leah, but there had been several other tenants before him, each one leaving without much fanfare. No one had stayed for long. As they pored over the property records, they found another troubling detail. An entry in the local zoning board records that mentioned the house being sealed shortly after the Cooper family left. The documents noted that the house had been temporarily closed for safety and repair reasons, but there were no records to explain what the repairs entailed. A note, written in the margins of the zoning report, referenced unexplained damage to the property's foundation, damage that had never been fully addressed or explained. Why had the house been closed off in the first place? And what had happened during that period when it was left vacant? Ben felt his stomach tighten as he looked at Leah. There's something here. There's something we're not being told. Leah nodded, her eyes scanning the documents. It's like the town's trying to hide something. But why? What are they trying to protect? Ben wasn't sure, but he had a feeling they were getting closer to finding out. He had already made a decision. He was going to speak to Detective Nolan, the officer who had been involved in the Cooper case years ago. They had tried to find the triplets once before, but with no leads, the case had gone cold. Perhaps now, with the new evidence they had found, they could stir something up. The following afternoon, they met Detective Nolan at the local diner, a small, cozy establishment that had seen better days. The booth they sat in was tucked in the back corner, offering a quiet place for conversation. Detective Nolan was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern face, his eyes still sharp despite the years of cases he had worked on. When Ben and Leah sat down, Nolan gave them a weary look, as if he had already seen too many stories like theirs. "Ben, Leah, what can I do for you?" Nolan asked, folding his arms across his chest. Ben leaned forward. "We found something. We found evidence about the Cooper triplets. Things that were hidden. A crate with their personal belongings. It's clear the triplets were kept somewhere, and we think they were hidden here, in this town. We need to know what happened." Nolan's expression didn't change, but Ben could see the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had clearly heard this story many times before. "You're not the first to look into this, you know," Nolan said, his voice low. "The Cooper case has haunted this town for years. It's the kind of case that never leaves you." "I know," Ben replied, "but we found new evidence. Photographs, a library card, toys. Something doesn't add up here, Detective." Nolan's eyes narrowed. "What did you find?" He leaned in slightly, clearly interested. Ben and Leah exchanged a glance before Ben took out the photograph and the library card, placing them on the table between them. Nolan's eyes immediately fixed on the photograph of the triplets. "I know this photo," Nolan said quietly. "It's from the last known picture of them, taken a day before they disappeared." "But how did you get this?" Ben didn't answer directly. Instead, he spoke about the crate, the way it had been hidden behind the wall in their house, and the strange connection it had to Vernon Hale. Nolan listened carefully, absorbing every detail. "When did you find this?" Nolan asked, leaning back in his seat. "2 days ago," Leah answered. "In the garage. We don't know who put it there, but we're starting to think someone knew what happened to the boys." Nolan's eyes remained fixed on the items on the table, his fingers tapping nervously against his coffee cup. "There's more to this story than I ever let on," he muttered. "I've always had a feeling, but there was never enough to go on. The town was too quiet. People moved on, and I was left with nothing but empty theories." Ben's heart raced. "Detective, we think the boys were hidden. We think someone kept them here in town. And it wasn't just some coincidence." Nolan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. If someone hid those boys, it wasn't Vernon Hale. He was a loner, kept to himself. But maybe he was involved. Maybe he knew something. The conversation shifted to the other tenants who had lived in the house before Vernon Hale. But the more they spoke, the more questions arose. Nolan's mind seemed to work in overdrive, turning over every detail. And Ben could tell the detective was beginning to piece together his own suspicions. After a long pause, Nolan looked at them both. "I'll look into this. We need to dig deeper into Vernon Hale's background, his connections, and his time here. We'll also need to see if there's any record of the town's involvement in sealing off the house." Leia nodded, grateful for the detective's help, but there was still so much they didn't know. As the conversation came to a close, they agreed to meet again the following week, after Nolan had gathered more information. After leaving the diner, Ben and Leia walked back to their house in silence. The weight of the conversation hung heavy between them, but there was a sense of determination in the air now. They were on the verge of uncovering something huge, something that had been buried for years. The truth was out there, waiting to be found, and they were getting closer to it. The days that followed were filled with tension and anticipation. Ben and Leia could feel the weight of their investigation hanging over them, with each new lead sparking more questions than answers. It was as if they were on the edge of uncovering something monumental, but the truth was still elusive, hiding just out of reach. Detective Nolan had promised to look into Vernon Hale's background and any other potential leads, but so far, he had come up with little more than vague rumors and half-remembered conversations from people who had lived in Rosewood County long ago. Still, Ben and Leia couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the brink of something far bigger than they had anticipated. The crate in the garage, the library card, and the photograph, they all pointed toward a hidden truth, and they were determined to uncover it, no matter the cost. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben and Leia sat in their living room, staring at the photograph of the triplets once again. The same three boys, smiling in matching red jackets. They looked so alive in the picture, so full of promise, yet they had been missing for over 35 years. Ben's eyes traced the lines of their faces, wondering if they had ever known the fate that awaited them, or if they had been kept in the dark, their lives controlled by someone else. Leia broke the silence. "What if we're looking at this all wrong? What if the triplets weren't taken by one person, but by many? What if they were kept in different places, hidden from the world?" Ben looked at her, his mind spinning. "I don't know, Leia, but everything we've found so far, Vernon Hale, the crate, the sealed house, none of it makes sense. Why would someone go through all this trouble to keep them hidden? And for 35 years?" Just as the question hung in the air, Ben's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, recognizing the name on the screen. "Detective Nolan." "Ben." Nolan's voice crackled through the phone. "I've got something. You're not going to like it, but we need to talk." Ben's heart raced. "What is it, Detective?" Nolan paused for a moment. "I've been digging into Vernon Hale, like I promised, and I found something that might change everything. We need to meet. Now." Ben's grip tightened on the phone. "Where?" "The old trailer park on the edge of town. I'll meet you there in an hour. It's important." Ben hung up the phone, his mind racing. He turned to Leia, who had been listening to the conversation. "It's about Vernon Hale. We need to go meet him. Now." Leia nodded, her eyes wide with uncertainty. "What do you think he found, Ben?" "I don't know," Ben replied. but I have a feeling we're getting close. Too close. They didn't waste any time. Leia grabbed her jacket, and they headed out the door, the cool evening air biting at their skin as they drove toward the outskirts of town. The old trailer park was eerily quiet. The faded mobile homes lined up in neat rows like forgotten relics of another time. Most of the trailers were abandoned, the windows boarded up, but there was one trailer at the very end of the park that stood out. A trailer that seemed to have been used recently. The lights inside flickered dimly, and the front door creaked open as Ben and Leia pulled up. As they stepped out of the car, they saw Detective Nolan standing outside the trailer, his hands in his pockets, his face serious. His usually calm demeanor was replaced by something darker, something more urgent. "What did you find, Nolan?" Ben asked as they approached. Nolan glanced around, as if making sure they weren't being watched, before motioning for them to follow him inside. The trailer was small and cramped, but there was something unsettling about it. The air felt thick, heavy, like something had been hidden there for a long time. Once inside, Nolan led them to a table in the back of the trailer, where a stack of old papers and photographs were scattered across the surface. Ben felt a shiver run down his spine as he saw what lay before him. It was a collection of old police reports, yellowed with age, and a few handwritten notes that seemed to have been jotted down in haste. "These are copies of the original reports on the Cooper case," Nolan explained. "But there's something I found in here that you won't believe." He handed Ben a folded photograph. Ben unfolded it slowly, his breath catching as he saw what it depicted. It was another photograph of the triplets, but this time, they were not smiling. They were standing in front of a broken-down building, their faces pale and gaunt. Their eyes were hollow, their expressions eerily blank. It was as if they had been drained of all emotion, all life. The photo was taken in the same place where the first photograph had been snapped, but something was terribly wrong. "This is a different photo," Ben said softly, his voice filled with disbelief. "How is this possible? Why would they look like this?" Nolan leaned in, his eyes dark. "I think this photo was taken years after the boys went missing. But what's even more disturbing is what I found in the report." He flipped through the pages of the old file until he found what he was looking for. It was a confidential memo, dated several years after the triplets had disappeared. It was marked sealed evidence, and it contained disturbing details about an underground network that had operated in the town during the 1990s. According to the report, there were rumors of children being taken and kept in hiding, moved between different homes and locations in Rosewood County, for reasons that were never fully explained. Ben's blood ran cold. "You're telling me the triplets weren't just abducted, they were kept hidden by people in this town?" Nolan nodded gravely. "That's exactly what I'm saying. And I think Vernon Hale was involved in this network. There's more to this than anyone realized. The triplets, along with other children, were hidden in plain sight. They were moved around, kept from the authorities. The people who did this were careful. Too careful." Leia stepped forward, her voice trembling. "But why? Why would someone do this? Why hide these children for so long?" Nolan shook his head. "I don't have all the answers yet, but I have a feeling we're dealing with something far bigger than just one person. I think Vernon Hale was just a part of a much larger operation. This town has secrets, secrets that no one wants to talk about." Ben turned to Leia, his mind racing. The photo, the reports, and the rumors, all of it pointed to one unsettling conclusion. The triplets hadn't just disappeared. They had been kept alive, hidden away in some twisted conspiracy that no one had ever uncovered. And if they had been hidden for so long, where were they now? "We need to find out who else was involved," Ben said, his voice filled with urgency. "We can't let this go. The triplets deserve the truth. Elaine deserves the truth." Nolan agreed. "We'll need to go deeper into this. We'll need to track down every lead we can find." But I have a feeling that there's someone out there, who knows exactly what happened to the Cooper boys." As the conversation went on, Ben and Leia's determination only grew stronger. The truth was out there, hidden beneath layers of secrecy and lies. But they were getting closer. They could feel it in their bones. The triplets, Daniel, Evan, and Miles, were not gone forever. Their story wasn't over yet. And soon, they would find out what really happened to them. The days after the discovery at the trailer park felt like a blur. Ben and Leia, together with Detective Nolan, began to piece together the final pieces of the puzzle, their resolve stronger than ever. Every lead they uncovered, every detail they dug into, brought them closer to the truth. The weight of the mystery that had plagued Rosewood County for over 30 years was finally beginning to lift. But there was one last piece they needed to understand: the fate of the Cooper triplets. The investigation had taken a toll on them all, but it had also brought them closer to understanding what had really happened in this quiet town. The triplets, hidden away for so many years, had been victims of something far darker than anyone had ever imagined. The underground network that had kept them, and others like them, hidden from the world, was now exposed. But there were still questions that needed to be answered. Ben and Leia sat in their living room one evening, the weight of their recent discoveries hanging over them like a heavy cloud. They had spent the past few days meeting with Elaine, sharing their findings and piecing together the story that had been buried for so long. The photograph, the library card, the confidential reports, it was all coming together. As they sat in silence, Leia finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "Do you think they're still alive, Ben? The triplets. Do you think they're out there somewhere?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the photograph they had found in the crate, the one of the triplets, smiling and carefree. They were no longer just faces in a picture to him. They were children who had been stolen from their mother, hidden away in the shadows, their lives erased by the cruelty of others. "I don't know," Ben said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "But we have to believe they're out there. We have to give Elaine the truth she deserves." Leia nodded, her gaze fixed on the photograph. "Elaine deserves that at least, after all these years of not knowing." Before they could continue, the sound of a car pulling up outside caught their attention. Ben stood and walked to the window, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Detective Nolan's car parked outside. "Looks like we have news," Ben said, his voice filled with anticipation. Leia stood up as well, a nervous energy in her movements. "Do you think he has news about the triplets? About where they are?" "I don't know," Ben replied, his mind racing. "But if there's anyone who can finally bring us answers, it's Nolan." As the doorbell rang, Ben opened the door to find Detective Nolan standing on the doorstep, his face grim but determined. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room briefly before resting on Ben and Leia. "I think it's time we talk," Nolan said, his voice low and serious. Ben's heart pounded as he led Nolan into the living room. "You've found something, haven't you?" Nolan nodded, his expression solemn. "I've spoken to a few more people who were involved in the network that hid the triplets. We've got confirmation now. Confirmation that the boys were kept alive, hidden away for years." Leia's breath caught in her throat. "Where are they now, Detective? Are they still alive?" Nolan sat down, his eyes meeting theirs. "We've traced some of the individuals who were involved in moving the triplets. One of them finally came forward. They told us that the boys were kept in a remote location for years, but they were eventually moved out of town. I can't tell you exactly where they are now, but I can tell you this: they're alive, they're safe, and they're free." Tears welled up in Leia's eyes as she glanced at Ben. The weight of their search, the pain of the mystery, seemed to lift just a little. But the truth was finally out. The triplets had been hidden for so long, but now they were free, alive, safe, and free from the darkness that had controlled their lives. "Elaine!" Ben whispered. "We need to tell her." Leia nodded, her hand gripping Ben's tightly. "She deserves to know. She needs to know that her children are alive." They wasted no time. Together, they drove to Elaine's house, the same heavy silence hanging between them. When they arrived, Elaine was waiting for them, as though she had been expecting them all along. Her expression was a mixture of hope and fear, her eyes tired but alert. Ben stepped forward and spoke softly. "Elaine, we've found them. We've found your boys." Elaine's face immediately crumpled, her hands trembling as she placed them over her mouth. She took a step back, as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "What?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "What do you mean? Where are they? Are they alive?" Ben nodded, his eyes filled with compassion. "Yes, Elaine. They're alive. They've been kept hidden for all these years, but they're free now. They're out there, somewhere, and they want to come home." Tears streamed down Elaine's face as she sank into the chair beside her, her hands clutching the edges of her skirt. She let out a sob, her chest heaving with emotion. "I never gave up on them," she whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. "I never stopped believing. But I thought I was just holding on to a memory, a dream. I never thought I'd hear this. Never thought I'd know the truth." Leia knelt beside Elaine, her hand on the older woman's shoulder. "Elaine, they're coming back. They're alive, and they remember you. They've been waiting, too." Elaine nodded, her eyes still filled with tears, but now there was something else, hope. For the first time in years, Elaine allowed herself to believe that her children might finally be coming home. Ben turned to Nolan, who had stepped back, giving them space. "How soon will we know where they are? How soon can we get them here?" Nolan's eyes softened. "We're working on it, Ben. It'll take time, but we're making progress. You'll be the first to know when we have a concrete lead." Elaine looked up at them, her voice barely audible. "I just want to see them. I want to hold them again. I want to be their mother again." Ben nodded, his heart aching for her. He knew that the journey was far from over, but they had reached the end of the beginning. They had uncovered the truth, and now the triplet story could finally have the closure it deserved. "We'll make sure you get that," Ben promised, his voice steady. "We'll make sure they come home." The days that followed were filled with anticipation, and yet, for Elaine, they felt like an eternity. The truth had been uncovered. Her children were alive, and they were coming home. But the final step, the reunion, was still waiting to happen. As the weeks passed, the weight of the past 35 years began to lift piece by piece. For Elaine, the grief that had held her captive for so long was starting to fade, replaced by something else. Hope. Hope that her boys, Daniel, Evan, and Miles, would finally return to her. Ben and Leia stood beside Elaine during the waiting period, offering their support as she navigated this new chapter of her life. The detective work wasn't over yet, but Nolan kept them updated, slowly but surely tracing the trail of the triplets. They knew they were close, and every day felt like it brought them one step closer to the long-awaited reunion. For Ben and Leia, the experience had been a deeply transformative one. They had come to Rosewood County seeking peace, away from the noise of the city, but they had found something far more profound. A mystery that had remained unsolved for over 3 decades, a family torn apart, and an investigation that had unearthed hidden truths. But more than anything, they had found the importance of never giving up. That even the smallest clue, the smallest connection, could lead to the biggest revelation. As the search continued, word spread throughout Rosewood County. People who had long since left the town began to return, drawn by the promise of answers. Neighbors who had once avoided speaking about the disappearance of the triplets now came forward, sharing memories, stories, and pieces of information that had once been buried in the past. It was as if the whole town was awakening to the truth, and with it, a collective sense of closure. Elaine's garden, once a place of quiet reflection, now became a symbol of rebirth. Every day, she planted new flowers, each one a token of the years she had spent waiting. The lilies, in particular, bloomed with vibrant colors, standing tall as a metaphor for the hope that had sustained her throughout the years. The bright petals caught the sunlight, a reminder that even the darkest of times could give way to something beautiful. Finally, the day came when the triplets were found. They had been living under different names in a far-off town, hidden away from the world for so many years. But now, they were safe, and they were coming home to their mother. The reunion was emotional, a moment that words could hardly capture. When Daniel, Evan, and Miles stepped out of the car, their faces were unfamiliar, yet the bond between them and their mother was undeniable. Elaine ran to them, her arms outstretched, as the boys, now young men, embraced her for the first time in more than 3 decades. Tears streamed down her face, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of joy, of relief, of healing. As Ben and Leia stood back, watching the reunion unfold, they shared a quiet moment of their own. They had helped uncover the truth, brought peace to a broken family, and in doing so, had fulfilled the purpose that had brought them to this quiet town in the first place. The triplets were finally home, and with their return, Elaine's heart was whole again.